$10,000. That was the number printed in bold red ink across the violation notice the HOA taped to my front door. I remember staring at it, my hands shaking, my stomach twisting, wondering how a freshly painted fence could possibly cost me more than my monthly mortgage. But this wasn't about a fence. It was about power. And they thought I'd roll over and pay. They didn't know who they were dealing with. 3 weeks earlier, I had replaced the old, rotting wooden fence around my backyard. I followed every guideline in the community handbook, submitted the required forms, and even waited for written approval. The email from the HOA clearly stated that my request was approved. I saved it, printed it, filed it, because something about our HOA president, Mark Delaney, always made me uneasy. He liked control. He liked reminding people that he was in charge. And he especially liked targeting homeowners who questioned him. 2 days after the fence was finished, he showed up unannounced, standing in my driveway with a clipboard. He didn't greet me. He didn't smile. He just said, "This color isn't compliant." I told him I had approval. I offered to show him the email. He waved me off. "Rules change," he said. "They changed yesterday." Yesterday. After my fence was built. I felt the first spark of anger then, but I kept my voice calm. I asked him to send me the updated policy in writing. He smirked. "You'll hear from us." What I heard was the slap of paper against my door and a $10,000 fine for non-compliant exterior modification. $10,000, due in 30 days, or they would begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. Over a fence they had approved. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the notice, replaying every conversation. Fear crept in. What if they really could take my home? What if I couldn't afford to fight? Then the fear hardened into something else. Resolve. Because I had the approval. I had the emails. And I had just enough savings to hire an attorney. If they wanted $10,000, I would show them what accountability actually cost. By the time I finished reading that notice for the 10th time, I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready. And if they thought I'd quietly hand over $10,000, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The next morning, I made a phone call that would change everything. That single call would set in motion audits, depositions, and discoveries the board never expected, exposing emails, secret votes, and conflicts of interest buried beneath years of intimidation and unchecked authority. That would be their mistake. The attorney's office smelled like leather and old paper, the kind of place where serious problems came to die quietly in filing cabinets. I slid the violation notice across the desk and watched his expression change as he read the amount. 10,000, he repeated. I nodded and handed him the printed approval email. He read that too. Slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled, not sympathetically, but strategically. They approved this in writing, he said. And now they're claiming a rule change after the fact. Yes. Did they notify the community of this rule change? No. He tapped the desk with his pen. Good. Good. That was the first time I felt the balance shift. He explained that HOAs operate under strict governing documents, bylaws, covenants, state statutes. They can enforce rules, yes. But they must follow due process. Proper notice. Recorded votes. Documented amendments. If they skipped procedure, he said, this fine won't hold. Then he asked the question that made everything bigger. Has this board targeted you before? I hesitated. There had been warning letters over trivial things. A trash bin left out an hour too long. A flower pot supposedly outside the approved color palette. Each one signed by the same HOA president. Yes, I admitted. He nodded like he expected that answer. Then this may not just be about a fence. Within an hour, he drafted a formal dispute letter demanding proof of the rule change, minutes from the board meeting where it was approved, and documentation showing homeowner notification. The letter also demanded an immediate suspension of the fine. When I signed it, I felt something I hadn't felt since that red notice appeared on my door. Control. The letter was sent certified mail that afternoon. 3 days later, I received a response not from the HOA's general office, but from their attorney. That told me everything. The letter was aggressive. It claimed the board had full authority to modify aesthetic guidelines at any time. It warned that failure to pay would result in liens against my property. But there was one thing missing. They didn't include proof of the vote. They didn't attach meeting minutes. They didn't show homeowner notification. My attorney noticed it immediately. "They're bluffing," he said. And then he suggested something bold. Instead of simply fighting the fine, we would countersue. For selective enforcement. For harassment. For improper governance. For damages. If they wanted to intimidate me with $10,000, we would respond with $100,000. That number wasn't random. It represented legal costs, emotional distress, and punitive damages for abusing their authority. When the lawsuit was filed, the entire neighborhood found out. And suddenly, I wasn't the quiet homeowner with a non-compliant fence. I was the person challenging the board. That's when the real pressure began. The shift in the neighborhood was immediate. Before the lawsuit, people avoided eye contact out of habit. After it was filed, they avoided eye contact out of fear. Fear of being associated with me. Fear of becoming the next target. Within a week, rumors started circulating. I was suing the community. I was trying to bankrupt the HOA. Someone even claimed I had refused to follow simple rules and was now playing the victim. That narrative didn't come from nowhere. It came from the board. An emergency community meeting was announced through email. The subject line read, "Important legal matter affecting all homeowners." Affecting all homeowners. As if I had done something to them. I attended the meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner. The HOA president sat at the front table with the other board members, their attorney seated beside them. He didn't look at me. But he talked about me. "Certain individuals," he began, "have chosen litigation over cooperation." Murmurs rippled through the room. He framed it carefully. The board had acted in good faith. The fence violated new aesthetic standards. The fine was appropriate. The lawsuit was unnecessary. And defending it, he warned, would cost the HOA money. Translation, it would cost the neighbors money. Then came the subtle threat. If the HOA loses, he said, legal expenses may require a special assessment. A special assessment meant every homeowner would pay extra. Suddenly, I wasn't just the woman fighting a fine. I was the potential reason for higher fees. After the meeting, 2 neighbors approached me quietly in the parking lot. "Did they really approve your fence?" one asked. "Yes." "In writing?" "Yes." They exchanged looks. "We've had issues too," the other admitted. But no one wants to fight them. That was the board's power. Isolation. Intimidation. Divide and control. The next week, violation notices started appearing on my door again. My mailbox post was leaning. My lawn edging was inconsistent. My house number font was non-standard. Petty. Relentless. My attorney called it retaliation. And retaliation, he said, strengthens our case. So we documented everything. Every notice. Every email. Every public statement from the board. Then something unexpected happened. During discovery, we formally requested internal communications regarding my property. Emails. Text messages. Board discussions. They were legally required to produce them. When the first batch of documents arrived, my attorney called me immediately. "You need to come in," he said. His voice wasn't calm this time. It was energized. Because buried in those emails was something the HOA president never thought anyone would see. A message sent weeks before my fence was finished. Subject line: "We need to make an example." I will never forget the feeling of reading that email. Subject line: "We need to make an example." It had been sent by the HOA president to the rest of the board 2 weeks before my fence was even completed. 2 weeks. Before any so-called rule change. Before any violation. Before the $10,000 fine. The message was blunt. "She's been questioning too many decisions lately," he wrote. "If we let this slide, others will think they can push back too. We need to make an example." There it was. Not about paint. Not about aesthetics. Not about protecting property values. It was about control. And I was the warning sign. My attorney looked at me across the conference table and said 3 words I'll never forget. "This changes everything. Because intent matters. Selective enforcement matters. Abuse of authority matters." And now we had proof. The rest of the email chain only made it worse. One board member suggested waiting until my project was finished before announcing the updated guidelines. Another asked whether they needed a formal vote. The president replied, "We'll handle the paperwork after." After. Meaning the rule didn't even exist when they fined me. They weren't enforcing policy. They were inventing it. When my attorney filed the amended complaint, adding claims of bad faith governance and intentional retaliation, the tone from the HOA's legal team shifted immediately. The aggressive letters stopped. The threats slowed. Then came the call. Their attorney requested mediation. Mediation is what parties ask for when they don't want a judge seeing everything. Especially emails like that. We agreed. But we didn't go in weak. We calculated damages carefully: legal fees, stress-related medical bills, lost work hours, and punitive damages for malicious conduct. The total? $100,000. When the mediation session began, the HOA president avoided eye contact for the first time since this started. He looked smaller. Less certain. Their attorney tried to argue that the email was taken out of context. That it reflected frustration, not intent. But context didn't erase the timeline. The rule change had been documented after my fence was completed. And after the fine was issued. Which meant the fine had no legal foundation. Halfway through mediation, their side made their first offer. They would drop the fine. No apology. No damages. Just move on. My attorney didn't even look at me before responding. Not acceptable. Because this wasn't just about canceling $10,000 anymore. This was about accountability. About sending a message that power can't be abused without consequences. The session ended without agreement. Which meant the next step was court. And once we stepped into a courtroom, those emails would become public record. The entire neighborhood would see exactly how their board operated behind closed doors. The HOA thought they were protecting their authority. Instead, they had documented their own downfall. The courthouse felt colder than I expected. Not physically. Emotionally. Because this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was a legal battle, documented, recorded, and about to become part of public record. When we filed for trial after mediation failed, word spread fast. Neighbors who had once avoided me were suddenly watching closely. Some even began quietly reaching out, asking questions about their own past violations. It turned out I wasn't the only one who felt targeted. But I was the first one willing to fight. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, the HOA president sat at the defense table, stiff and composed. He still wore that same air of superiority, but it looked rehearsed now. Controlled. Forced. because discovery had already revealed too much. My attorney began with a simple argument: the fine was issued before any legitimate rule change existed. The board acted in bad faith. The email titled "We need to make an example" demonstrated retaliatory intent. The defense tried to soften it. They claimed it was informal language. They claimed the board had broad discretion. They claimed the timeline was merely administrative delay. Then my attorney displayed the email on the courtroom screen. Large. Clear. Unavoidable. Silence filled the room. The judge leaned forward. "Is this an authentic communication from the HOA president?" she asked. Their attorney hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." "And the rule change referenced in the fine was formally voted on when?" Another pause. "After the fence was completed." That answer shifted the air in the room. Because due process doesn't work backward. You cannot punish someone based on a rule that doesn't yet exist. The judge didn't rule that day, but she made her position clear. "Selective enforcement and retaliatory conduct are serious allegations," she said. "This court will review the evidence carefully." Outside the courtroom, something changed. The HOA president didn't speak to reporters. Yes, local reporters had shown up after court filings became public. He walked quickly to his car, head down. And neighbors were watching. Within days, more documents surfaced during extended discovery. Board meeting minutes that didn't match internal emails. Votes that were recorded differently in official records than in private discussions. One board member had even emailed concerns about legal exposure if they pushed too hard. That board member resigned quietly the following week. Pressure was building. And for the first time since this started, I felt it shift completely off my shoulders and onto theirs. They had tried to intimidate me with a $10,000 fine. Now they were facing public scrutiny, legal exposure, and a lawsuit that wasn't going away. Then, 2 weeks before the trial date, their attorney made another call. This time, the tone was different. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Careful. They wanted to talk settlement again. But this time, the number they mentioned made me sit very still. When my attorney hung up the phone, he didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me. "They're ready to be serious," he said. Serious meant money. Not just dropping the fine. Not just quietly rewriting their guidelines. Money. Their new offer was $50,000. Plus removal of the fine. Plus written acknowledgement that the violation had been issued in error. It was a dramatic shift from drop the fine and move on. But it still wasn't $100,000. And more importantly, it didn't include public accountability. Because one of our conditions had been clear, any settlement required a formal statement to the community clarifying that the board acted improperly. They resisted that part. Hard. Money was one thing. Admitting fault was another. The HOA president still believed he could protect his image. He assumed homeowners would forget once the lawsuit disappeared. But the lawsuit wasn't just about money anymore. It was about exposure. By this point, more neighbors had come forward privately. One showed me violation letters for landscaping that had never been cited before. Another had been fined for a driveway crack that mysteriously wasn't mentioned in other homes. Patterns were emerging. Selective enforcement wasn't isolated. It was systemic. And the email "make an example" proved intent. My attorney laid out the risk to them clearly during the next negotiation session. "If we proceed to trial," he said, "every email becomes public. Every inconsistency in your minutes becomes evidence. And if punitive damages are awarded, the amount could exceed 6 figures. That was not a threat. It was reality. HOAs depend on perception of authority. Once credibility cracks, the entire structure weakens. The board members began turning on each other behind closed doors. We knew because additional emails were accidentally included in a supplemental production. One message from a board treasurer read: "This is getting out of control. We should have handled this differently." Another said: "We never voted on that amendment properly. Never voted properly. That alone could invalidate not just my fine but multiple enforcement actions over the past year." The pressure was no longer just legal. It was political. And that's when the HOA president made his first visible mistake. At the next community meeting, clearly frustrated, he addressed the lawsuit publicly. He called it a nuisance claim blown out of proportion. He said I was seeking a payday. What he didn't know was that the meeting was being recorded. And that statement directly contradicted the mediation discussions already on record, discussions where they had admitted procedural mistakes. My attorney smiled when he saw the clip. "Now," he said, "we have leverage." A week later, their attorney called again. The number had changed. 75,000. Plus removal of the fine. Plus attorney fees. Plus a community-wide clarification letter. We were getting closer. But we weren't there yet. Because the number that started this wasn't 75,000. It was 100,000. And they were about to find out how serious I was. By the time their offer reached $75,000, the board was no longer unified. You could see it in their body language at meetings. Board members who once sat shoulder to shoulder now left space between their chairs. Conversations stopped when certain people walked into the room. Smiles looked strained. Confidence had turned into damage control. Because this wasn't just my lawsuit anymore. It was their credibility. Homeowners had started requesting financial records. They wanted to know how much had already been spent defending the case. They wanted to see insurance policies. They wanted to know whether board members could be personally liable. That question hit hardest. Personally liable. If a court determined that the HOA president acted in bad faith, insurance might not cover everything. Individual board members could be exposed. And suddenly, supporting him became expensive. At the next closed board session, details later revealed in meeting summaries, 2 members formally questioned the decision-making process behind my fine. They wanted documentation proving the rule had been properly amended before enforcement. There wasn't any. Because it had never happened. One board member resigned outright. Another publicly stated she had relied on information provided by the president. Translation: blame was shifting upward. Meanwhile, the community meeting turnout doubled. Homeowners who had once stayed silent were asking pointed questions. Was the rule change voted on? Why wasn't notice given? Are we at risk of paying for this? The HOA president's answers were vague. Defensive. Carefully worded. But vagueness doesn't survive scrutiny for long. Behind the scenes, settlement discussions resumed again. This time, the HOA's attorney sounded less like a negotiator and more like someone trying to contain a wildfire. They offered $90,000. 90. Plus full attorney fees. Plus a written letter acknowledging procedural errors. Plus an agreement to revise governance policies. My attorney looked at me and raised an eyebrow. "They're scared," he said quietly. And he was right. Because trial would mean subpoenas. Depositions under oath. Financial audits. Cross-examinations. And if punitive damages were awarded, the amount could exceed what they were offering now. But accepting $90,000 would avoid that risk. Avoid the uncertainty. Avoid months more of stress. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same place where I first stared at that $10,000 notice. I thought about the fear I felt then. The anger. The humiliation of being targeted. This was never about money. It was about respect. About proving that authority without accountability is just bullying with paperwork. The next morning, I told my attorney something simple. If we settle, it has to be complete. Not partial justice. Not quiet damage control. Complete accountability. He nodded. Then he made one final demand. $100,000. Public letter of fault. Governance reforms. And resignation of the HOA president. Their response would determine everything. The demand was clear. $100,000. Full attorney fees. A public letter admitting procedural failure. Governance reforms. And the resignation of the HOA president. When my attorney sent that final proposal, we both knew it wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about survival. Theirs. 3 days passed with no response. Then 5. Then 7. Silence can mean confidence. Or collapse. On the 8th day, an emergency board meeting was announced. Not the usual community discussion tone. This one was labeled, Executive Session, Mandatory Attendance for Board Members. That wording alone told me everything. Behind closed doors, they were choosing sides. Later, through follow-up disclosures and conversations with neighbors, I learned what happened inside that meeting. The HOA's insurance carrier had reviewed the case file. They had read the emails. They had examined the timeline. And they had issued a warning. If the case proceeded to trial and punitive damages were awarded due to intentional misconduct, coverage could be denied for certain actions taken in bad faith. Meaning, the board members, especially the president, could be personally responsible. That was the breaking point. Suddenly, loyalty turned into liability. One board member reportedly said, "This started over a fence. Now it could cost us our homes." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They had threatened foreclosure against me. Now they feared financial ruin themselves. The next morning, my attorney received the call. The tone was completely different. No posturing. No legal bravado. No threats masked as policy language. "We accept the terms," their attorney said. "All of them. $100,000. Full reimbursement of legal fees. Formal written acknowledgement that the fine was improperly issued. Community-wide notice of procedural corrections. And the resignation of the HOA president effective immediately." When my attorney relayed the message, I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just exhaled. Because this had never been about winning a lottery ticket. It was about restoring balance. A week later, the settlement agreement was signed. Confidential financial details were finalized. The payment schedule was executed promptly, faster than I expected. Then came the community letter. It was brief but powerful. It stated that the fine issued against my property had not followed proper amendment procedures. It acknowledged internal missteps. It committed to governance transparency moving forward. And at the bottom of that notice was a separate statement. The HOA president had resigned for personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. At the next open meeting, a new interim president took the floor. His tone was calm. Measured. Almost cautious. He spoke about rebuilding trust. About oversight. About fairness. And for the first time in a long time, the room felt less tense. Not because power had disappeared. But because accountability had finally arrived. And it all started with a $10,000 fine they thought I would quietly pay. A few months after the settlement, the neighborhood felt different. Not quieter. Not friendlier overnight. But balanced. The intimidation that once lingered in the air had faded. Board meetings were no longer lectures delivered from a position of unchecked authority. They were discussions. Votes were documented properly. Notices were clear. Timelines were followed. Policies were no longer invented after the fact. Transparency had replaced fear. The new interim president implemented reforms exactly as outlined in the settlement agreement. Rule amendments now required recorded votes and community notice before enforcement. Financial statements were posted quarterly. Homeowners were invited to review minutes without resistance. And something unexpected happened. People started speaking up. Not angrily. Not aggressively. Just confidently. Because when one person challenges unfair power and survives, it changes what everyone believes is possible. As for me, the money arrived in scheduled payments, covering legal fees and the agreed damages. But the check itself was never the most important part. What mattered was this. They had tried to weaponize policy against me. They had tried to isolate me. They had tried to intimidate me into silence. And instead, they exposed themselves. The former HOA president moved out quietly within 6 months. No announcement. No farewell message. Just a for sale sign that appeared one morning. I don't know whether it was embarrassment, pressure, or simply the weight of consequences. But I do know this. Power without accountability always collapses eventually. It just needs someone willing to test it. Sometimes I walk past the fence that started everything. The color hasn't changed. It was never non-compliant. It was never the issue. The issue was ego, control, and the assumption that homeowners wouldn't fight back. The $10,000 fine that once felt like a threat became the foundation of something bigger. $100,000 wasn't revenge. It was a reminder. A reminder that rules apply to everyone, even the people who write them. And every time a new homeowner asks about the story, I tell them something simple.
Document everything, know your rights, and never assume authority means court stance, because the most expensive mistake the HOA never made wasn't issuing a fine, it was believing I would quickly pay it. If this story made you rethink how power works in your own community, make sure subscribe, because in HOA Legend justice doesn't stay silent for long.